Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cary Coglianese. I'm the director of the Penn Program on Regulation at the University of Pennsylvania. PPR is pleased to have organized and sponsored today's webinar, Cars and Climate, the Electric Vehicle Transformation, which is offered as one of many events during Climate Week here at Penn. This panel focuses on one of the crucial issues at the interface of law, technology, and climate change: how to move a massive transportation system deeply dependent on gasoline to a system reliant on more climate-friendly energy sources, and to do so while ensuring safety and equity too. This is a vital challenge that calls for public and private sector coordination and sensible regulatory decisions. I'm very happy that you could join us for today's discussion, which features 4 leading experts from the US and Europe, and I'm very much looking forward to what they have to say. I'm also thrilled in a moment to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Shelley Welton, who will introduce each of the panel members and moderate today's discussion. But before I introduce Dr. Welton, let me first thank Dr. Andy Coopersmith, PPR's Managing Director, for organizing today's session with his characteristic wisdom and organizational skill. And I also thank Anna Gavin on the Penn Law events team for so ably helping coordinate the Zoom webinar setup. I also want to let members of the audience know that we encourage you to ask questions during today's session using the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We might not have time to get to all of your questions, but we will try to get as many of them as we possibly can. And for anyone with colleagues interested in these topics but who couldn't join in today's discussion, please feel free to let them know that we will be posting a recording of today's session to the Penn Program on Regulation's YouTube channel. We'll post those details in the chat, but you can also always visit our website, pennreg.org, to find the link. And now, without further ado, I have the distinct honor to introduce our moderator for today's panel discussion. Dr. Shelley Welton is the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Law and Energy Policy at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School, where she holds also an affiliation with the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. Previously, she taught at the University of South Carolina School of Law, as well as served as the Deputy Director of Columbia Law School's Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. A prolific scholar and an extraordinary teacher of administrative law, energy law, environmental law and policy, and climate change law, Professor Welton is someone who I am thrilled to have as a colleague, and thrilled as well to turn things over now to moderate today's session. Shelley?
Great, thanks, Cary, very much. And welcome everyone to Cars and Climate, the Electric Vehicle Transformation. As Cary suggested, it's just an incredibly timely moment to be talking about this industry, which is both central to tackling the climate crisis and in a period of real dynamism. So I'm honored to get to moderate a wonderful and diverse group of experts on this topic today. I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing the group, then we're going to turn to brief opening remarks and what I anticipate will be a very lively discussion among our panelists, aided by questions from all of you. So feel free to pop questions in the Q&A anytime during the discussion. I'll be monitoring it as we go. So without further ado, our panelists are Vicki Arroyo, and Vicki currently serves as Associate Administrator for Policy at the Environmental Protection Agency, where she oversees a diverse portfolio of responsibilities, including regulatory policy, climate adaptation, environmental economics, and more. She also previously oversaw EPA's environmental justice work. And before EPA, Vicki served as Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center at Georgetown Law, where she was also a professor from practice and director of the Law and Public Policy Program. Our second panelist is Genevieve Cullen, who served since 2015 as president of the Electric Drive Transportation Association, EDTA, a cross-industry trade association that promotes battery, hybrid, plug-in hybrid, and fuel cell electric drive technologies and infrastructure. Genevieve was previously EDTA's vice president, directing the organization's policy and advocacy efforts, And prior to joining EDTA, she provided energy policy counsel to policymakers in the federal government, including serving for several years on Capitol Hill as energy counsel to Senator Evan Bayh. Our third panelist is Simon Godwin, who's a delegate for European Government Affairs for BorgWarner, a global automotive supplier based in Brussels, Belgium. He previously served as director of UCAR, the Research Association of European Passenger Car and Commercial Vehicle Manufacturers. And prior to that, he held a number of engineering, strategy, and public affairs positions at Daimler AG in Stuttgart, Washington, D.C., and Brussels. And last but not least, we're joined by Professor John Graham, who's a professor of risk and policy analysis at Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs, where he also formerly served as dean. He also, before joining IU, he was dean of the Frederick Party Rand Graduate School at the Rand Corporation. And earlier in his career, he founded the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis, which he led until 2001, when he was confirmed to serve as administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. His many academic publications include the book that was published last year, The Global Rise of the Modern Plug-in Electric Vehicle, Public Policy, Innovation, and Strategy. So I'd now like to invite all of our panelists to join with their video and audio, and we will get things started. Welcome, all of you. And I thought I'd start with Vicki. And Vicki, I'd like to ask you to kick things off by painting us a picture of the current U.S. regulatory environment for electric vehicles.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Penn Law for this great event. It is a really important and exciting time to be working on the transition to electric vehicles, vehicles that rely less on oil and, of course, pollute less, both with conventional air pollution contributing to so many health issues, as well as greenhouse gases that are driving climate change. And we urgently need to support this shift, as transportation is the largest emitting sector of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. And the great news is that this shift is happening. I say this as a proud EV owner myself. I drive a Chevy Bolt from 2018. And this is going to continue to accelerate given a number of drivers, pun intended, including, as Shelley, you're mentioning, the regulatory space, in addition to some of the incentive programs now that are underway. So I wanted to start with a couple of the examples, or more than a couple, from the regulatory work that EPA is doing, and also the state work that I had the privilege of supporting in my previous role at Georgetown. And of course, all of this leadership in the policy space and the regulatory space is now only bolstered and supported even further by the bipartisan infrastructure law and IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. EPA is working to deliver on the regulatory roadmap that the president laid out in his executive order strengthening American leadership in clean cars and trucks. And last December, we released greenhouse gas standards for model years 2023 to 2026 light duty vehicles. This is proving a strong launching point for future actions. The rule strengthens standards beginning in model 2023 with increasing year-over-year stringency. And this was an important step on putting the U.S. on a course towards a zero-emission future and reestablishing the U.S. auto industry as the global leader in clean vehicle technology. We are now focusing on a proposal to establish multi-pollutant emission standards for light-duty and medium-duty vehicles for model years 2027 and later, with that release anticipated early next year. Also, to ensure that we meet the president's goals, we've developed a clean trucks plan describing a series of regulations that will reduce pollution from large commercial heavy-duty trucks and buses. This past March, we issued a proposal to significantly reduce emissions of smog and soot-forming nitrogen oxides from heavy-duty gasoline and diesel engines. We're working to finalize this rule by the end of the year. And EPA is currently developing a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking to consider strong greenhouse gas standards for 2027 to 2029 heavy-duty vehicles, which we'll issue later this year. We're also working on the heavy-duty phase 3 greenhouse gas standards for this sector to begin as early as model year 2030, and we expect that proposal also next year. So as I mentioned, this builds on leadership that the states have been showing for some time. California, of course, has led the way on vehicle standards with a landmark zero-emission vehicle mandate back in 1990 and the nation's first greenhouse gas emission standards for cars in 2004. In 2020, California issued the the Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which mandates that an increasing percentage of trucks sold in California be zero emissions vehicles. And of course, our administrator, Michael Regan, acted earlier this year to reinstate California's authority under the Clean Air Act to implement its own greenhouse gas emission standards and ZEV sales mandate, and to withdraw an interpretation that the Clean Air Act would prohibit other states from adopting California greenhouse gas emission standards. In August of this year, California Air Resources Board approved a ban on the sale of new gasoline-powered cars by 2035. And other states like New York are already following California's lead. So all in all, it's a really exciting time. I see that there are colleagues from DOE on the call in the participants list. Check out DOE's Alternative Fuels Data Center, which lists so many state laws and incentives related to EV technologies. These are so important, including for low-income communities that bear the brunt of air pollution from the traffic that moves through neighborhoods. So as we invest in EVs, we're also investing, of course, in transit and active transportation alternatives as well. We're building at EPA on this state and local leadership, and would love to talk more as we talk about things like Bill and IRA subsequently, and the deployment of electric school buses and battery recycling, but I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Vicki. And Genevieve, I thought we'd turn to you next and ask you to offer us the trade association perspective on the EV landscape. What are you excited about? What challenges do you see ahead?
Great. Thanks, Shelley. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. And as has been well noted, this is a really important moment in technology and policy and the marketplace. And that's the intersection where EDTA lives. As Shelley mentioned, my members represent the entire value chain of electric transportation. So it's vehicle manufacturers, electric utilities, companies in the materials supply chain, from inverters to lithium, and companies who are at the forefront of infrastructure deployment. So we are a really diverse group of folks. And I think the only thing that they all can agree on is that the future of transportation is electrification. And even in that agreement, people can have different reasons why electrification is the answer. Whatever your question is, you're going to end up there. As has been noted, obviously transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and you need to electrify to address that. This is where the global market is going. So if the United States wants to be a leader in the technology that's going to drive the next century, we have to invest in electrification. This is also part of energy security. Turn on the TV and be reminded why we need to have a different way of powering our transportation sector. And it also is essential, in fact, to environmental equity, because the communities that suffer the most from air pollution are often at-risk communities, and by electrifying personal and commercial and public transportation, that's how you get at better health outcomes in at-risk communities. So there's lots of reasons to do this, and what we're seeing, the market is responding because, one, technology has been accelerating faster than most people even anticipated. The performance of batteries and costs have been coming steadily down from over $1,000 a kilowatt hour incremental cost for lithium ion batteries in 2010 to under 100 currently. So this is a big change. The market is growing. In 2010, there was two plugins that you could get. Now there are about 70 miles on the road, and in the next 3 years, there'll be another 55 that have already been announced. And that's just in the passenger duty space. So that's an enormous growth. And at the same time, infrastructure is expanding. There's over about 123, roughly, 1,000 public charging stations. That doesn't count homes or workplaces that are currently operating in the United States. And there are more than 3 million plugins on the road. So we are poised and have gone to, in this year, reached 7% of new car sales. So there's a lot of market energy, and that is coinciding with this great policy energy that Vicki noted. The work that's going on in the states, coupled with an administration which has a strong vision for electrification that includes enormous investments in infrastructure, in building supply chains and manufacturing, and to try to build out consumer demand and as well and the commercial vehicle market. So there's a lot of pieces in technology markets and policy, and I'm excited to talk about them all.
Wonderful. Thanks, Genevieve. So we're now going to turn to Simon, and I wanted to ask you to offer us a comparative perspective and talk a little bit about the EV landscape in Europe.
So good afternoon, good evening for me, and thanks for the invitation. So what I'll do initially is just to give an overview of the regulations in Europe as they apply to as they impact electric vehicles. So I'm Simon Godwin. I'm the Delegate for European Government Affairs for BorgWarner. We're a global automotive supplier headquartered in Michigan. Our company vision is of a clean, energy efficient world, and we realize that vision through our mission, which is to deliver innovative and sustainable mobility solutions for the vehicle market. We were originally a company focused on the internal combustion engine, but since 2015, we've been transitioning through acquisitions and organic growth into all electrification products that are relevant to the vehicle: motors, power electronics, batteries, and on and off-board chargers. Our most recent strategy, called Charging Forward, announced last year, projects that nearly half of our business worldwide by 2030 will be in electrification products. And that means likely a higher share than that in Europe. So let's look at the regulations that are relevant in Europe. So regulations that have already passed. In 2020, there was a phase-in target of the 95 grams per kilometer fleet average target for cars and vans. And that was complied with by the vehicle manufacturers, with in total a 10% share of the market of plug-in vehicles, so battery electric and plug-in hybrid. In 2021, that 95 gram target was fully phased in, and that was complied with a 20% share in the market of plug-in vehicles. This year, about 15% of the market is fully electric plus additional plug-in hybrids. So it's really been growing, very much driven by those regulations. How did we get there? So three elements to it. Regulations. The regulations required OEMs to sell a certain proportion of their vehicles to be plug-in in order to meet those CO2 targets. So that was really the main driver. But there were also subsidies which were provided by national governments, and they obviously encouraged the purchase by consumers for those vehicles, so making it really possible to hit those market shares. And also the infrastructure. We're transitioning now from what was originally mainly home charging to there being actually a business case for companies to provide charging on the street at fuel stations, etc. And that really is growing very, very strongly in Europe. So what about the future regulations? So in 2025, the CO2 regulation for fleets for cars and vans will be a 15% reduction compared to that 95 gram target. That's going to require OEMs to sell about 30% of their fleet as plug-ins. In 2030, the target almost certainly, it's nearing finalization, will be a 55% reduction compared to the 2021 target. And that requires more than 50% of the fleet to be zero emission. That's one way of complying. And in 2035, the target for fleets will be zero CO2. That means 100% of the fleet would have to be zero CO2 vehicles. Also, we've got regulations for heavy duty vehicles, a 15% reduction in 2025 compared to the baseline, which is calculated on 2019. A few percent of vehicles in the heavy duty space will have to be zero emission to meet that target. And a 30% reduction in 2030, about 20% of the fleet would have to be zero emission already. And there's an upcoming proposal for heavy duty vehicles, which is likely to change those figures to a higher percentage reduction requirement. So therefore will require higher percentages of the fleet to be zero emission. And potentially a zero target for heavy duty vehicles, perhaps in the 2040s as well, requiring all vehicles to be zero emission. The UK has got similar, but actually more ambitious regulations, which I can maybe go into in a bit more detail later. So that sets out what we need to achieve in the next decade or two. Perhaps in in the question and answer session afterwards, we can look more in depth at the impacts of that and the framework conditions that are necessary to achieve it.
Great. Thanks very much, Simon. So finally, John, I know you've thought deeply about a lot of the benefits and challenges of our approach to EV policy. Could I get you to just offer a few opening remarks in those directions?
Sure, Shelley, and it is an exciting time to be a student of the auto industry. This is the biggest transformation since the horse and buggy. President Biden has said we're going to get to 50% electric cars by 2030. State of California, as Vicki noted, wants to ban them by gasoline cars by 2035. But are these policies practical? I hope they prove to be practical because I'm very excited about electric vehicles, but let me offer some of the challenges that we have ahead. Challenge one, affordability. The US is way behind the curve in developing an affordable electric vehicle market. We're at 7% share, as Genevieve noted, in the US. Europe's about 25% right now, as is China. The difference is they have affordable electric vehicles in those markets. In the US, the average transactions price for all vehicles is $46,000. For an EV, it's about $66,000, and that price is rising, not falling. Of the 100 EV models now available for sale in the US market, only 15 have list prices below $46,000. Several of the affordable models have been on the market for a good while, and they have not been commercially successful. They are sometimes called compliance cars, since they really are there to generate some compliance credits for California's regulations. Challenge two, increasing battery prices. The lithium-ion battery pack represents about 40 to 50% of the cost of producing an EV. From 2010 to 2021, the average price of a battery pack worldwide dropped by more than 85% due to economies of scale in production and learning economies. Reputable forecasters suggested that by the end of this year, batteries will be so cheap that electric cars would be less expensive than gasoline cars. Those forecasts were wrong. Starting in late 2021 and throughout this year, battery prices have been increasing. The major reason is that the prices of raw materials, lithium, nickel, and cobalt have exploded. Lithium is up 589%, cobalt is up 119%, and nickel is up 55%. Raw materials now account for the majority of the cost of a battery pack. Challenge three, the response of the mining sector will be delayed and gradual. Since few batteries have been in use for a long period of time, recycling alone cannot meet the surge in global demand for batteries. A rapid expansion of the mining and processing sectors is crucial. Take the case of lithium, which is essential to all the battery chemistries that automakers are now looking at. New lithium mines take anywhere from 8 to 15 years to reach full production. Recent proposals for new lithium mines have been canceled or delayed in Serbia, Portugal, Mexico, Chile, and in both North Carolina and Nevada. In each case, the developers encountered intense, well-organized opposition from local communities and environmental groups. They don't want lithium mines. The most progress with lithium has been made in Australia, where many of the existing and new mines are owned by Chinese companies. Once lithium is mined, it must be processed, and most of that refining capacity is in China. Challenge four, the US Congress has delayed the offer of consumer tax credits for electric vehicles until these electric vehicles can be assembled in the United States and until a supply chain that is North American based is developed. The US currently accounts for less than 1% of the global electric vehicle supply chain. It will take many years for the US to develop this capability and to compete effectively against China and other Asian competitors. Fortunately, President Biden and the Congress have established some new subsidies to develop an electric vehicle supply chain in the US, and it will be interesting to see how successful this effort is. Finally, the final challenges I want to make is that we don't have technology neutral policies in the United States. Both the federal government and the state of California are favoring all electric vehicles over hybrids, both plug-in hybrids and conventional hybrids. This may be a policy mistake. Both China and Europe have seen plug-in hybrids capture a substantial share of the new vehicle market. Hybrids can be seen as a constructive transition technology, especially in a world where we have a shortage of lithium-ion batteries. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Wonderful. Thanks to all of you. So I thought I'd just kick things off by asking if anybody wants to have a quick response to anyone else's opening comments before we get into some questions.
I'm happy to jump in, Shelley. But I think and just to John's multiple well taken points. Yes, this is why we call it a transformation. We are on a journey to rethink over 100 years of transportation policy and technology and replace all of those pieces. So it's not an overnight process, and agreed with we are going to be putting new pressures on the global supply chain, which is why we absolutely need to be investing in all of those approaches. It's reduce, reuse, replace, and recycle. We've seen the market do this before with platinum and catalytic converters, right? When things are too expensive, too scarce, or unsustainable, markets and technology find a way. And I think that's just, we are investing in that. The industry is, and the US government is investing in more resilient supply chains. And I would absolutely agree that as we do build these supply chains, we certainly need to be creating opportunities to be working with global partners who are ethically and sustainably providing these critical materials.
Yeah, maybe that's an opening. Vicki, you mentioned that you would be excited to highlight some of the new efforts that the government's undertaking to fund EVs. And so I thought I'd maybe turn it over to you to sort of think about how we might tackle some of these affordability challenges and what's coming down the pike there.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, the ones that are really related to EPA's work might be narrower than some of the things that Genevieve's mentioning. But clearly, there are a lot of incentives to try to get at this market and to create homegrown supplies of some of the things that are critical minerals that we need for the battery production, and incentives in that regard. And I will say, John, in your litany, I did not hear you reference the high gasoline prices that we also live through from time to time. And as an EV owner, there was an advantage, for that period of time when there were lines at the pump and very high prices to drive right past them. And, that's what we're trying to avoid too, right? That kind of, boom and bust cycle and the vagaries of that market, in addition to the other reasons why we're trying to move towards either plug-in hybrids, as you say, or to more battery electric technology. But just to share a little bit about what the bill provides in terms of leadership around things like clean school buses. The bill provided EPA with $5 billion over 5 years for the replacement of existing school buses with low and zero emission school buses. And in May, we announced the availability of $500 million, but there was such overwhelming demand from school districts all across this country that EPA is now doubling the amount of funding that will be awarded under that program, $965 million. And these will transform how millions of students get to and from school and will reduce their health risks from diesel air pollution and what's happening in their neighborhoods, of course. Bill also contains significant additional funding for charging infrastructure through our sister agencies. US DOT programs include National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, $5 billion that provides funding to states to strategically deploy EV charging infrastructure and establish an interconnected network to facilitate data collection, access, and reliability. There's a discretionary grant program for charging and fueling infrastructure of $2.5 billion. This includes 50% of the funding for community grant programs where the priority is given to projects that expand access to EV charging and alternative fueling infrastructure within rural areas and low and moderate income neighborhoods, communities with a low ratio of private parking spaces. It also includes installation as an eligible expense under the US DOT Surface Transportation Block Grant Formula Program. So that's some of the other federal family funding. It also gives U.S. Postal Service $3 billion to make their fleet cleaner. And you might have followed that US EPA actually had made these kinds of recommendations for US Postal Service to consider the advantages of moving from gas fleet diesel to gasoline primarily to electric vehicles in our comments of their EIS, as their competitors are doing, and the US Postal Service is indeed doing that now, even before the new funding. It's increasing its commitments, but of course, the Inflation Reduction Act is making that more possible with this $3 billion. It also implements a variety of measures to promote domestic manufacturing of electric vehicle and supply chains. For instance, the Advanced Energy Project Credit provides investment tax credits for projects that equip or expand manufacturing facilities producing specified renewable energy equipment. IRA revised and expanded that credit to encompass electric and hybrid vehicle production. So those are just a few examples.
Thanks, Vicki. I wonder, John, if I might ask you to sort of prognosticate going forward. Do you feel like the approach that's being taken in the IRA and bill might address some of the affordability issues you're highlighting?
I think it's a step backward in the short run, and hopefully it's a step forward in the long run. Now, why would I say it's a step backward? One of the few progress areas we have in affordable electric vehicles is coming from Hyundai and Kia. And they have several excellent products on the market that were actually selling very well, and they were still eligible and benefiting from the consumer tax credit that existed. Under the new consumer tax credit, they're prohibited from getting the credit because they assemble these vehicles in Korea and ship them to the United States. So now we have one of the most exciting areas of the affordable market having a pretty big setback. For a low-priced vehicle, $30,000, losing the $7,500 credit is a big deal. I mean, when Tesla gets an additional $7,500 on a $100,000 vehicle, it's not nearly as important, and frankly, not as good a use of the money. And that was one of the good things about the new tax credit.
Shifting gears just a little bit, one of the things that I see coming up in the Q&A is some skepticism about whether California can meet its ambitious targets. And Simon, I thought I might turn to you and ask you to talk a little bit about the EU targets and how it's going, the attempt to meet these. Do you think that the EU targets will be met, which, as I understand, are fairly comparable to the ambition of the California targets? And what do you see as some of the main challenges in that regard?
Okay, well, I think that's really a key question, because we do have some very ambitious targets in the EU and in the UK, indeed. So, you know, I talked about those three elements of regulation, subsidies, and infrastructure. So, you know, what we've got at the moment is less than a fifth of the market is electrification. Well, about a fifth of the market is plug-in if you include plug-in hybrids. And of course, that fifth of the market is probably the enthusiasts. And that fifth has been pushed by significant subsidies. But we've got to get to meet the targets that, you know, are actually on the horizon in 2035, 100% of the market to go zero emission. We've got to get 100% of consumers to buy zero emission cars and vans. And so, you know, that's the regulatory push, but the subsidies won't last forever. Obviously, it's not going to be affordable for governments to subsidize vehicles that are going to be 100% of the market. So they've got to pay for themselves. And then this, of course, goes back to the question about affordability. And however many subsidies you give to companies, or for, you know, production, or for raw material extraction, eventually that's got to be economic in itself. And so, you know, we have to look at what are going to be the trends in the next 10, 15 years on the costs, and also on how the extent to which consumers are going to take up these vehicles. And there are significant headwinds. If you look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I'm sure that, you know, that's one of the projections about battery costs that's very well known. Their data from earlier this year said that costs are about battery packs around about $125, $130 per kilowatt hour. They said it's going to go up a little bit this year and then start going down again. the projections that we've seen on raw materials indicate that in the medium term costs will go down, but then when it comes to 2030 and later, they're going to go up again of the raw materials, simply because there's going to be so much demand, especially coming from Europe, around about 2030 in particular, because of the massive demand that's going to be created. So that demand is simply going to push prices up. So that's a big headwind. You've also in the EU got the batteries regulation, which is quite a strong set of regulations on the sustainability of batteries, which is also going to make them more difficult to produce, increase the costs of those batteries. So we need to have what needs to happen over the next 10 years is for those pressures which reduce the cost, in particular of batteries, but also the other components of electric vehicles, economies of scale in particular, and new chemistries, new ways of making the cells, new ways of packing the cells into packs, etc. Those developments have got to happen more quickly than those headwinds that we see. I'm not saying that's going to happen or that that's not going to happen. I'm just saying that there's significant uncertainty about those things, and they're not necessarily things that we can make happen through subsidies. Those are things that are going to happen if the conditions are right. We're pushing the market at the moment. The regulations are to a certain extent ensuring that there will be economies of scale, but there are significant uncertainties still there for the future compliance.
Any other thoughts from the panel about sort of upcoming challenges or optimism about the ability to meet these very ambitious targets?
Yeah, let me just chime in on the natural feeling is from people is that if you create demand for things like lithium and so forth, then the global supply will respond. And I teach economics and free markets, that's usually not a worry, but the mining sector is not a free market. You have to have a permit to mine. And those are very difficult to get those permits. And that's why there's going to be a lot of sluggishness. And you can see this even in the case of the Biden administration. On the one hand, they want to be very pro electric vehicles, but on the other hand, we need permitting reform to make it possible to accelerate the rate of pace at which we get this infrastructure, both the mines done and the processing. And frankly, we should be candid about the fact that processing the materials, this is a dirty business, creates wastes, requires permits. This has to be done well, but it has to be done fast. These are the real issues involved in this transition. They will determine how fast it happens.
If I may, and John is right, these are challenges, and transitioning the oil and gas industry works this way now, if you want to call it works, right? That there's an exploration piece, there's a refining piece. The United States exports a lot of what it extracts and has it and refines it overseas because the economics and the environmental challenges associated with oil refining. So we are trying to create a supply chain that serves an electric transportation sector, and we have the opportunity to reimagine this, right? So yes, securing energy always will create waste. How do you manage that? How do you make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? And so, yes, will that slow things down in the short term? Yes, and rightly so, maybe. There will put upward pressure on prices. We can drive down costs in other elements, as Simon noted, to squeeze out some of those savings. And also, as Simon noted, are subsidies sustainable forever? I don't know. Let's ask the oil and gas folks, shall we? But so I'd say, and it's not just the consumer side, it's the investment side. We are making those investments through the technology and the manufacturing and the processing supply chain. And those are all part of that. And that's how we are making a transformation, not throwing a switch, making a transformation. So yeah, there are real challenges, but I think we have some good pathways for addressing them.
Great, thanks. So one of the questions that's coming up a lot in the Q&A has to do with equity. And we've already talked a little bit about affordability, but I thought we might talk about the other side of the picture, which is really the built environment. So how do we make sure that the built environment supports everyone being able to access EVs and charge EVs? And maybe, Vicki, do you want to kick things off with how your office is handling some of these issues?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's an area that I did some work on with the states before coming to EPA. And it's an area that our Office of Community Revitalization, which is in our Office of Policy, is working on, along with our sister agencies at DOT and DOE, because you're absolutely right that the communities that suffer from the lack of transportation options, whether it be electric vehicles or reliable transit or safe sidewalks for walking and safe roads for bike access or bike paths, are the ones that are experiencing dirtier air as well. And so we think that a real concerted approach to look at the investments that we're making in communities that really considers really the legacy of redlining. 50 years later, we're seeing tens of millions of Americans that are breathing dirtier air than their counterparts because they tend to live near major highways and roads and ports and industrial facilities. And of course, these health impacts can lead to all kinds of lung function issues, asthma, heart attack, strokes, and more. So one of the things that we are doing with our sister agencies is to have a pilot program that's really trying to better inform the federal spending around these areas to make sure that disadvantaged communities can see the multiple benefits of this transportation investment in these communities, and they can really have a voice and agency in how these programs are developed. And we can incorporate the lessons from these communities into EV infrastructure deployment plans at a scale based on some of these pilot projects that we are trying to get off the ground to maximize the multiple benefits to these communities. So we are trying to align and invest federal dollars from not just EPA, but from DOT and DOE in ways that increase transportation electrification and distribute the benefits of electrification more equitably, in addition to conversations around investment in safer roads and sustainability and resilience. So we're in the planning stages of this project, but we have a couple of jurisdictions already in mind who are interested and working with the clean communities of DOT and the DOTE and the DOT DOE joint office on these pilot projects on charging infrastructure in these jurisdictions.
Shelley, if I could just add on to that, I just think it's also important when we think about affordability and accessibility of electric transportation is to remember that electric transportation is not just an individually owned passenger car. And obviously that is important too, and having public infrastructure that serves multi-unit dwellings and urban environments is really important. But I think it's also important to look at the electrification in rideshare, in rental fleets, the emergence of this growing secondary market, the used car market, that's going to be extremely important in sort of changing the demographic of who's driving EVs. It's also the other piece of it's public transport as well, and making sure that buses and the depots that serve them are operating cleanly and accessibly, and that changes neighborhoods too.
On the equity front, there are two, I think, very important provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. One is we finally have both income and price caps on these subsidies for consumers who purchase an electric vehicle. That was an innovation that was already in California that's now in the federal program as well. I mean, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for taxpayers to be subsidizing people to buy Teslas. We need to get beyond that point and get the affordable end of the market subsidized so we can move in that direction. The other second thing that's important in that bill is a tax credit for electric vehicles that are purchased in the used car market. And this is, of course, where most low-income and working class people purchase cars. This is a highly constructive endeavor. I don't know that the exact parameters of that used vehicle tax credit were exactly on the mark. It has a very high price number on that $25,000 number, but nonetheless, it's a big change and a recognition that there is an equity issue here. This whole program is a big subsidy for high income buyers, even with the price caps there. So that the used car market needs a lot of serious attention.
So one set of questions that I'm seeing come up has to do not with the front end supply chain issues, but with the back end issues, right? So what do you do with these batteries once they're done in cars? So I have some questions about recycling, and then also what's happening with the possibility of giving secondary life to EV batteries. One commenter notices that these batteries retain 80% capacity at the end of their life in a vehicle. So I wonder if you all might talk about some of the policy approaches to these challenges and what you think's working, or maybe what we need in this space.
So I'll just jump in because EPA has a role under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to develop best practices, or the bill to develop best practices for the collection of batteries to be recycled and voluntary battery labeling guidelines. And we're collaborating with DOE, with states, tribes, local governments, nonprofits, and the private sector. I will say the military has been recycling batteries in this way for some time and creating kind of little resilience hubs, batteries that, as you heard from the person in the chat, retain a lot of the power. So in addition to recycling the batteries for the critical minerals that we've heard already on this call are kind of difficult right now to get at, you can actually use the batteries themselves for other uses.
Maybe I can give a
sorry,
go
ahead, Simon.
Thanks. Maybe I can give a bit of an insight in Europe, because as I mentioned before, we've got the batteries regulation, which is currently in the final stages of its negotiation. And that is all about the sustainability of batteries, not just for automotive, but also for automotive. And there are a number of elements to that. So the recyclability of vehicles, targets for that, targets for the amount of recovered material, so lithium, nickel, cobalt, etc., how much of it should actually be recovered. Some quite high targets are expected there. Also targets for the carbon footprint of batteries as well. And also targets for the recycled content. So a certain amount of lithium, cobalt, etc., in a battery from 2030 would have to be from recycled material. That's one where we're a little bit concerned, because what that means is that there's basically a limitation on the growth of the market if you're saying that only that, for example, 4% of the lithium in a battery has to be from recycled material. If that the amount of recycled material is available is limited, then so is the 100%, which is the amount of lithium you can actually use in a battery. So it's useful to have these regulations in place, and we welcome them in general, but they also have to make sure that you don't have unintended consequences. There's also in this regulation a requirement for producers of the batteries to have end-of-life responsibility, and that means that they have to take responsibility for the collection and recycling of the batteries. So all of this makes a lot of sense, but the devil is really in the detail. You have to make sure that such rules are drafted in such a way that they don't create those unintended consequences.
Genevieve, were you going to add something?
Oh, yes, I just wanted to point out, and as we have discussed here, the components and the materials in these batteries are only going to be increasingly valuable. So the idea that we'll create some giant waste heap where people just walk away from them doesn't even make economic sense, never mind environmental sense, even if you were allowed to just create a heap of them. As Vicki pointed out, there's a lot of really interesting work going on, and utilities are doing a lot of it in the secondary market for batteries with that useful life, that vast majority of useful life still left, that creating energy storage options that are key to our goals for resilience, and whether that's at a home level or community scale or even utility scale energy storage. If we solve the problem of energy storage, right, not having to make all the electricity we could possibly need for every given moment, that changes the power ecosystem as well.
Just a quick note that DOE also has grants out supporting the development of recycling technology, trying to bring the cost down and to deal with the environmental issues associated with recycling itself. So I think that's a positive. I think we also have to keep in mind that all of the price estimates we've been giving you, they don't actually account for the collection and recycling. They're not built in yet into the price of these vehicles. So there has to be that in the future added in, which is why this whole question of how fast and how affordable is all very important.
So great set of questions that we're getting in the Q&A. Thank all of you for keeping them coming. So one theme that I'm seeing come up in a lot of these questions that I thought I might ask you all about is obviously at the same time that we're talking about transportation here, we also have to transform the grid to be ready to accommodate all of these cars. So there's a lot of questions that are just basically along the lines of, are we doing the second piece of the puzzle well enough to make EVs at a mass scale feasible? What do you all think? Do you feel like grid transformation is proceeding apace with EV market transformation? And maybe we could talk about it both in the US and in the EU, perhaps.
Well, the power sector's been decarbonizing for a while, right? In part because of state leadership, again, you know, on climate and clean energy policies, but also the drop in prices of renewables, which have made them, you know, more cost effective than we anticipated even. So, you know, I saw also a question in the chat about, you know, kind of some skepticism that the grid is decarbonizing, but in fact it is. And of course, EPA has authority, as we've seen, even despite some of the challenges in the Supreme Court, to proceed with regulation of this important sector. But again, the market itself is also shifting that sector to a much cleaner footprint, if you will.
And I would also jump in as utilities are part of my membership and have been part of EDTA for more than 30 years. And in addition to their efforts at decarbonization, the fact is that utilities are designed, although they're not made to be nimble necessarily, but they are designed to assess and plan for demand. That's what they did when central air conditioning was invented, right? When everybody got 5 flat screen TVs every Christmas, making sure that they have enough electricity to meet demand is their reason for being. And the fact is that with smart charging and infrastructure, using mobile storage is actually a grid asset, and it helps them plan to smooth out peaks and to store energy in valleys. And this is what they do. They are planning. Their horizon is in 30 to 50, not 5 to 10. So we're seeing it on the micro and the macro that utilities are in fact investing in this long game. And let me just say, because I think I've said it in every audience I've ever spoken to, when people say, aren't you just changing one thing for another, one fossil for another, when, you know, you're just creating more energy need that is just as dirty, and it's not. And people just need to understand that even with the grid, you know, with a coal dominated grid, you're still getting a 30% reduction in GHGs. Take it from somebody who, you know, worked in the state of Indiana with that 99% coal-fired grid, that if you switch now, you're still ahead of the game just by the efficiency of electrification and the relative ease of controlling a one smokestack as opposed to 260 million tailpipes. So the fact is, from the get, you're ahead of the game, and utilities are doing what they need to be doing to make this even better over the long term.
Yeah, I think I just want to add and
Sorry,
emphasize
John,
the
go ahead.
importance of natural gas in this conversation, which has been the major reason why CO2 emissions are down in the U.S. electricity sector. It's the explosion in low-cost natural gas through the new fracking technologies. Now, if you want to talk about wind and solar,
And also wind and
yeah,
solar
right.
prices come down, John. I'm sorry,
Pardon?
but it's wind and
No,
solar.
but if you quantify the reduction in the CO2 intensity of the electricity grid in the United States, like the last 10 years or so, the dominant factor has been the replacement of coal with natural gas. The renewables have made a contribution as well, but not nearly as big as the natural gas contribution. But let me just finish the point that we could have much bigger contribution from the renewables if we could find a way to do energy storage well. What does that lead to? Batteries. What does that lead to? Lithium, cobalt, all these same materials. It's all the same issue. We've got to figure out a way in the United States to get back into the mining and processing business, get permits for these things, have permitting reform. All that is critical to the renewables agenda.
I think that's a very important points from John there. Every time I've spoken today, there's been a bit of a theme, and the theme is there's a regulation in Europe for that. And there's a regulation in Europe for this point as well, which is there's a renewable energy directive, which is currently also being reviewed, should be finalized perhaps by the end of this year or next year. And that requires a certain proportion of energy in the EU to be from renewable sources. And that's very ambitious. So what that means is that the grid and energy in general is decarbonizing, and that's obviously on the basis of the great strides that have been made in wind and solar that are continuing. But there also has to be some kind of way for that to flow through to the energy market. I got into a Tesla taxi earlier this year, and the taxi driver told me that he loves it because he can put 10 euros worth of electricity into it in the morning, and it lasts him for the whole day. But that was earlier this year. Electricity bills in Europe have gone up by 5 or 6 times since then. So now he's paying 50 euros a day, which is obviously a different proposition. And we're rather shielded from changes in fuel prices, in gasoline prices, because the taxes are so high that even if crude oil goes up by a factor of 2, your fuel price goes up maybe by 15 or 20%. So his value proposition is much different now. But those electricity prices are going up based on the marginal cost, and the marginal cost is based on natural gas, which obviously is the one that's gone up significantly. So there also needs to be a consideration of how you can ensure that those the great strides that have been made in wind and solar are actually making their way through to people's pockets when they pay for electricity, and that then can be reflected in the advantages that electric vehicles have in terms of cost, because otherwise they're just going to suffer every time that there's a spike in the electricity price.
All right, well, I thought one fun last question to end with for our last minute might be this one. And you can keep your answers short, perhaps. If there's one thing you want listeners to know about the EV transition that you think isn't getting enough attention today, what would it be?
I'll start. I think they're really fun to drive, and that once you have one, you don't go back. I mean, it's so great not to have to worry about ever pumping gas again. And they have low or no maintenance cost, and they're just wonderful.
I think yes, 100% on what Vicki said, but I think the conversation about EVs is very much dominated. People think that in their passenger cars that there's just a Tesla and then nothing else. There are 70 vehicles today. That'll be double in that in a couple of years. Price points, capacities, what do you need? Do you tow children, boats? What do you need your car to do? And there is one, and that's available at your price point, at your capability point. You just need to look past. Do your homework like you would with any other car, and there are way more options today than people I think understand.
I wanted to talk about something that didn't get time for yet. Now, BorgWarner and a lot of our industry is really very much committed to the electrification transformation. But we also know that that's not the only game in town. The objective is not electrification. The objective is to reduce energy consumption and to reduce greenhouse gases. And there are other ways to do that in the transportation space. Electrification is a very important way, but there's also hydrogen fuel cells. There's also hydrogen engines. That's another way to use hydrogen, but without the massive intervention on by changing the vehicle technology. So that's the way to do it, to go to decarbonization of transport with much less effort, and also using the assets and the expertise and the employment that exists in all over the world in the internal combustion engine. And also thinking about things like low carbon fuels, e-fuels, low carb or sustainable biofuels are also things we need to consider, because even though they don't reduce the tailpipe emissions, they do reduce emissions overall. So as we go to much higher demands and much lower CO2 targets in Europe and elsewhere, we need to consider that electrification is one part of the picture, but there are many other options that we need to support as well.
Great. John, last word?
I agree with Simon on the heavy duty sector with regard to hydrogen. One point about the electricity coordination with the transportation sector. You look at California, the good news is they've extended the life of their last nuclear power plant by another 5 years because they need more electricity. The bad news is they're still importing 25% of their electricity from outside of California. And where is all that coming from? Neighboring states. There's some fossil fuels there too, and that's not computed in those statistics you see on the grid in California in terms of how clean it is. So we need some more nuclear power in the mix, as well as a lot of the other things people are talking about.
All right. Well, I want to thank all of our listeners for being with us today, and thank this wonderful group of panelists for this really dynamic, excellent conversation. It was really a pleasure to get to talk with you all today.
Thanks for having us.
Right.
Bye-bye.